Hey goals. So I just got out of watching Undertone, and I have a lot of thoughts about this movie. This is one of those movies where the premise actually sounds really interesting on paper, and I think that the trailer did a really great job selling that idea. The setup is intriguing. It's a paranormal podcast host named Evie, and these mysterious audio recordings that seem to contain something disturbing, something possibly supernatural, and the story unfolds as she and her co-host try to make sense of them. So on the surface, that's a really solid hook, a horror movie built around sound recordings and the slow unraveling of something sinister hidden inside audio files. It could have been something incredibly tense and immersive, but for me, the film kind of ends up taking the easiest possible route with that concept. It leans heavily on ideas and imagery we've seen over and over again in horror, and instead of building towards something meaningful or surprising, it kind of just stalls out. The story mainly follows Evie, who is dealing with a lot at once. She's caring for her dying mother while also processing the news that she's 6 weeks pregnant herself. And throughout the film, we watch her juggle those two emotional weights while she's also wrapped in these strange recordings that are becoming the centerpiece of her podcast. What's interesting structurally is that the movie is incredibly contained. For the entire runtime, we're basically in a single location, and Evie never really leaves the house, and the only other character we consistently see is her mother. And normally that kind of restriction can feel limiting, but here I actually think it works in the film's favor. It creates this really intimate, claustrophobic feeling where you're stuck in the space with the character. It almost feels like the walls are closing in a little bit, which is a really effective atmosphere for a horror movie like this. And honestly, the strongest element of this film is easily the sound design. Even without seeing it in a Dolby theater, the sound was really impressive. It's really clearly the focal point of the movie. And there were multiple moments where I genuinely turned my head because it sounded like something had happened in the room around me. There were loud thuds and subtle background noises, these eerie shifts in tone. The audio work is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of tension. I also really loved the use of negative space. We see Evie at her laptop, but there's tons of empty space around her, empty rooms and lamps and dark corners. It had me searching the screen constantly for any sort of movement or anticipating something about to happen in that far distance. But once the movie moves past its setup, the cracks start to show. The biggest issue for me is how the podcast element is structured. The entire premise revolves around these mysterious recordings, but the way the podcast segments are handled, it constantly pulls you out of that tension instead of pulling you deeper in. They'll start playing an audio clip and you finally get immersed into what you're hearing, and then suddenly someone says something like, okay, let's listen to the next one in a couple days, and then it just stops. And that happens repeatedly throughout the movie. Every time, it kind of feels like the movie is about to build momentum, and then it cuts itself off. It's like the film keeps interrupting its own scares. And on a practical level, it also just doesn't make much sense. They're talking about releasing episodes every Friday, but they're barely recording anything in a single session. The logistics of the podcast start to feel really weirdly distracting. Thematically, you can clearly see what the movie is trying to explore. The motherhood angle is very obvious. Evie is struggling with the responsibility of caring for her mother while also facing the reality that she's about to become a mother herself. She openly questions whether she's capable of that role, whether she'd be a good parent, and that guilt and anxiety is clearly meant to tie into the horror elements. And at the same time, the film plants this idea that maybe none of this is actually happening. So Evie's the skeptic of the podcast duo, and at one point, she even brings up the possibility of psychosis. So the movie seems like it maybe wants us to question what's real and what might be happening inside her head. But that's where things really start to feel frustrating for me. By the time we reach the ending, it doesn't really feel like the story went anywhere. And I'm not someone who really needs every single mystery neatly explained. I actually like ambiguity in horror when it feels purposeful, but here, it just kind of feels like the film stops instead of concluding. And we get these strange demonic sounds, reversed lullabies, unsettling noises, And then it just cuts to black. Throughout the movie, there are also these moments where her mother lifts her head up or appears to move around the room, and it's framed in a way that suggests Evie might be imagining it. But those scenes mostly feel like quick scare tactics rather than something meaningful to the actual story. The mother's presence feels oddly disconnected from everything else that's happening. She's clearly meant to tie into the motherhood theme, but narratively she doesn't really drive anything forward. In fact, part of me feels like the movie might have been stronger if it just committed fully to the audio concept. If the film had just simply been Evie alone at her laptop working through all 10 recordings one by one over the course of the movie, that sounds really interesting to me. Just her, the sound, and whatever horrifying stories those recordings slowly revealed, that could have been a really incredible, intimate, tense experience. But instead, the film introduces other elements that never really pay off. Another thing that just might be personal taste is that the horror ultimately leans into religious imagery. Demons, distorted baby noises, strange symbols, Catholic references, creepy shots of religious artwork, researching satanic words online. It's just all very familiar territory for the genre. And maybe part of the issue is that I just have a bit of religious horror fatigue at this point. When the scares start leaning heavily into that territory, it's hard not to feel like we've seen this thing 100 times before. And at a certain point, I found myself less scared and just more bored, which is frustrating because the ingredients were there for something genuinely unsettling. The sound design is really excellent, the confined setting really works, the lead performance is strong, and the concept of horror unfolding through mysterious recordings is a really compelling idea. But instead of building towards something terrifying or thought-provoking, the film just takes the most obvious route possible and then stops before it actually really says anything. And that's really what makes it anticlimactic. By the end, I wasn't confused in a fun way. I was just sitting there wondering what the point of the story was supposed to be. I really wanted to walk out of this movie feeling shaken or disturbed, and instead, it just kind of felt like the film ran out of things to say. All in all, I think that this is just another one of those horror films where the trailer and marketing really gave me high hopes and then let me down. And like I said, I genuinely think this is an interesting idea, especially with the podcast era that we're currently in. And of course, a horror movie like this was bound to happen. I just really wish that it went there, because instead I just left feeling really fatigued and mostly confused. If you haven't already, like this video and subscribe to my channel if you want to keep up to date with more movie reviews. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.